Hello, I'm Kerr. Welcome to my art studio. How much water you should use when you're painting with watercolour is often a problem. Now there are two golden rules with watercolour that many people don't know. And in this video, I'm going to tell you what those golden rules are. So, are you ready? The two golden rules of watercolour. Now, in order to tell you the first rule, I've got to tell you a little story first. But it only takes 1 minute. So stay with me. Okay, so here comes the little story. Once upon a time, no, we won't start that way. Here's the story. Those of you that can remember the late 1940s or early 1950s, remember, this only takes a minute. If you can remember those times, then you will know what I'm talking about. If you aren't old enough to remember those times, I will tell you. Just after the war, in the late 40s and early 50s, there wasn't enough food to go round. So the government decided to give every household a ration book. So in that book, there were pages for butter, pages for sugar, pages for meat, and you were only allowed to have a certain amount every week. So when you went shopping, you went into the shop and you said, "I'd like ½ a pound of butter, please." So the person in the shop took your ration book, tore out the ration for that day or that week, gave you back your book and gave you the butter. The next day you decided you wanted some more butter. So you go into the shop and you say, "I'd like some more butter, please." And the person in the shop says, "Haha, sorry, you've had your ration. You'll have to make do." End of story. Now remember what I've just said. You've had your ration, you'll have to make do. That's very important. You've had your ration, you'll have to make do. Let me show you something. Now, when you started painting in watercolour, can you remember doing this? Because I can. You've got all your paints mixed up. Here they are. Okay, and you start painting. And you put your paint on the paper. And then you go into another colour. And you put that on, and it's running where you don't want it to go. And then you put another colour on, and it's mixing up, and it's sort of it's all wishy-washy and it's not going where you want it to go. So we're going with the green. And there is no strength in the colour there whatsoever, and it's all blurring together and it just isn't doing what you want it to do. Look, it's running everywhere and you think, "I can't do this." Try that bit up there. And then the paper starts to buckle and you think, "Oh no." Remember it? Well, that's because you're breaking the rules. Let me show you what those rules are. Now, thinking back to that little story I told you about buying the butter, remember that sentence? You've had your ration, you'll have to make do. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to ration our water. Now, I want you to imagine that this is just ordinary clean water. I've put a tiny bit of red paint in there because if I left it as ordinary water, you wouldn't see it. So I've just very lightly coloured it, but I want you to imagine that that is just clean, fresh water. Now I'm going to pick up some water. Right, now that is my ration. Remember the butter? This is my ration. This is all I'm allowed. So I'll put that into my palette. Now that water has got to be divided up between my paper and my paint. Now if I decide to put lots of water onto my paper, then I'm not going to be left with very much to put in my paint. So let's put some water onto my paper to make it wet, because I've decided I want to paint onto wet paper. Now look, There is virtually nothing left in there to mix with my paint. So here's my paint. So I can pick up some of my paint and I can use up that little bit of water. There's not much, just a little bit. That's just about it. Just about it. Use that up. Put it into my paint. A bit more paint. A bit more paint. Now, that is what we call dry paint because it has very little water in it. So we refer to it as dry paint. So now I can come in here and I can paint onto my wet paper and I've got total control over where that paint goes. All right? I can make my paints as strong as I like, as long as I don't use any more water. I've used my ration. Okay, water is rationed. You've had your ration, you have to make do. I can have as much paint as I want, but I cannot put any more water in here. Because if I do, it means I'm cheating. I've got water from somewhere that's not allowed within my ration. So see, I have total control over where that's going. I've divided up my ration of water between my paper and my paint. Now, if I decided I wanted to do the opposite and I wanted to paint onto dry paper, okay, let's go back to the ration. Here's my water. There's my ration of water. Let's put my ration of water into my palette. Now, if I don't want to put any water onto that paper, look how much water I've got to play with. I can use all that for my paint if I want to. So let's pick up my paint and put it in. I can make a very, very strong, sloppy wash because I've got as much water in there as I like because I haven't used it on the paper. Now I can paint on my paper with my paint and look, I've got perfect control over where that paint goes. Because this time my ration of water is in my paint. Total control over where it goes. So the golden rule is, if you've got a lot of water on your paper, you cannot have it in your paint. Remember, it's rationed. If you've used most of it on your paper, you won't have much left to put in your paint. On the other hand, if you've decided to paint onto dry paper, you will have all your water, your ration of water, to mix with your paint. So you can have a nice, floppy, loose, wishy-washy, well, not wishy-washy, but a nice loose wash that you can control 100%. Now, what a lot of people do is that they make their paper wet and then they have a wash that looks like that. Now, if you'd followed the rules, that is not possible. Because if you'd followed the ration rules, you wouldn't have that amount of water left to mix your paint with. It will be on your paper. So you cannot have water on your paper as well as in your paint. It has to be in one place or the other. If most of it's on the paper, then there's only a tiny bit in your paint. If most of it is in your paint, then there'll be very, very little on the paper. Remember the story of the rationed butter. There you have it, the first rule of watercolour that probably nobody's ever told you. The wetter the paper, the drier the paint. The drier the paper, the wetter the paint. Remember that butter being rationed? Now remember that you have to ration your water. You have to divide it up between your paper and your paint. You cannot have it in both places at the same time. So you might say, what's the second rule of watercolour? Well, it's quite simple really. It's all to do with consistency of paint. I've mixed up my colours here and I'm just going to paint them straight onto the paper. Now the rule would apply whether you're painting onto wet paper or whether you're painting onto dry paper. It makes no difference. You have to have your paints the same consistency. So you haven't got one that's all runny. They're all roughly the same thickness of paint. Now I can come in and I can put some orange in there. And I can go over my yellow, no problem. I'm not going to get any runbacks because it's got the same proportion of water to paint. Then I can come in here and I can add some red. I'm doing this on dry paper, but this would work just as well on wet paper. I can come right down over my orange if I want to. And I can add some red to the bottom, turn my yellow into an orange. I could clean my brush off, but don't add any more water. Pick up my yellow and I could put that up here. And I could come right down over my red, no problem. And also, if I really wanted to, I could wipe off some of my watercolour with a sponge. Now, when you hear people say, oh, you can't erase watercolour, you can't get rid of it once it's there, rubbish. Absolute rubbish. Look. And get a tissue and wipe it off. Now tell me you can't erase watercolour. It's a load of nonsense. Now, as this is drying, if I still wanted to go on painting, then I have to be careful because it's gradually drying, and if I go in now with the same paints, I'm going to start to get runbacks. So what I need to do is I need to go in with a paint that's got even more pigment in it, so it's even more concentrated. There we go. No problem whatsoever. This is very, very thick paint. I've got a lot of pigment in there, more pigment than I had in those three. And look, no problem. On the other hand, if I had come in with one of these wishy-washy ones that we had earlier in the video, that one maybe, all wishy-washy. If I come in with that, put that on, you see what happens. The water is going to run and push the paint until it finds a little patch that's beginning to dry, and then it stops, and then it forms horrible little runbacks because that paint that I put on had far too much water in it. And that's why you get this awful, muddy, sloppy, uncontrollable mess. Whereas here, where I had this very concentrated paint, I could go on painting even though my layers of paint underneath were probably about half dry. So the second golden rule with watercolour is, when you're painting, have your paints the same consistency. So you don't have one that's all runny and one that's thick. They're all roughly the same consistency. And then when it begins to dry, if you still want to go on painting, then you have to have the paint with much more pigment in it. Those of you who've already watched my video on painting skies will recognise this. If you haven't seen that video, then I'll put a link to it on the screen. So this is when I painted the sky, and when I painted the sky, I used my yellows, my reds, my oranges with all the same consistency of paint. And then as it was beginning to dry, I dropped in my darker clouds with much heavier, thicker paint. So the second golden rule of watercolour is you can paint away quite happily on a wet painting, provided the mixes that you're using have the same consistency of pigment to water. You don't have one that's very strong and one that's very wishy-washy. They're all the same consistency. And as your paint begins to dry, you can still go on painting, provided you make your paint even stronger and thicker in consistency. I hoped you liked that little story at the beginning. Now, when you're painting next time, remember the rationed butter and remember your rationed water. Divide it up between your paper and your paint. If you found this video useful, then consider clicking that subscribe button. And if you've enjoyed it, then give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Remember, everybody, there is an artist in everyone. Goodbye for now.